He'd been alone so long the trees had become his only friends. Every morning, the lonely lumberjack cut deeper into the forest, as if trying to forget something that once mattered. When he came to the town auction that bitter autumn morning, he didn't expect anything to stir in his chest. But then they dragged out a girl with a scarf tied around her eyes and bruises on her wrists. Her father, drunk and spitting curses, shouted she was blind, useless, better off sold. No one raised a hand. No one even looked at her, except him. Something about the way she stood, still proud, listening, felt too sharp to ignore. He bought her for a handful of coins, and 3 days later, in the silence of the woods, he saw her lift the scarf slightly and follow the movement of a bird in flight. Under a dull gray sky, the town of Dry Hollow moved in slow, sluggish rhythm. The mud had hardened under a brittle frost, cracking beneath every wheel and boot, and the breath of horses steamed in the air like ghosts too tired to haunt. It was auction day, and that meant the center square was more crowded than usual. Not loud, just filled with men leaning on rifles, women with arms crossed over shawls, and a handful of children with wide, empty eyes. The wind stirred the dust but didn't lift the mood. The lumberjack arrived without a word. He was known to some, feared by others, but mostly forgotten. A man with broad shoulders wrapped in flannel and silence. He lived beyond the northern pines where no one dared go in winter. Most thought he'd gone there to die, but he hadn't. He worked the land, split timber, cooked alone, and answered no one. They called him the mountain shadow behind his back. He didn't care. He came down only when supplies ran low, and even then, he moved through town like wind through bare branches. That morning, he walked slowly into the square, boots caked with pine sap, coat heavy with the smell of smoke and cold. He wasn't looking to buy. He never was. He stood near the back as the auctioneer began shouting over a girl being led forward by the wrist. A man followed her, swaying on his feet, bottle still clutched in his hand. The girl's face was turned downward, a strip of cloth tied across her eyes. Her hair was long but tangled, her dress thin and tattered. She didn't stumble. She didn't flinch at the man's shove. She just stood there, like the only thing she had left was stillness. The auctioneer's voice rang through the cold air. The words were cruel, indifferent, like he was selling a sack of grain instead of a human being. Blind since birth, he said. Useless, but quiet. Won't talk back. Make her a kitchen ghost if you like. Or don't. Starting bid. $5. No one moved. A cough came from somewhere behind the wagons. The girl remained silent. The wind shifted. The father laughed, a dry, sour sound that cracked against the wooden platform. Hell, give me 2 and she's yours. I'm tired of feed-in shadows. The lumberjack's fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. He didn't blink. His eyes locked on the girl. She wasn't trembling. That struck him. Most girls in her place would be crying. This one, her chin was tilted up just slightly. Not high but deliberate, like she could sense every soul watching her. Like she'd already memorized the sound of their indifference. And still she stood. The hammer didn't fall. No one bid. The auctioneer shrugged, called her a waste, moved on. But the lumberjack didn't move. As the girl's father yanked her back by the arm and prepared to drag her from the platform, the lumberjack stepped forward. There were no words, no bartering. He handed over $2 silver, placed them in the drunk's open palm, and took the girl's wrist with a grip that was firm but not cruel. She flinched at first, not from pain but surprise. Then she went still again. He didn't lead her through the crowd. He walked beside her, slow, letting her match his pace. People parted. Some whispered. No one laughed. He didn't take her to the tavern. He didn't put her on a cart. He walked, past the outskirts, past the broken fence line, into the trees. The woods swallowed them by dusk. At his cabin, a small, sturdy structure nestled at the base of a stone ridge, He let her sit by the fire. He didn't ask questions. He didn't untie the scarf. She didn't speak. But when he brought her bread and a cup of water, she nodded once in thanks. That was all. Outside, the wind whistled through the evergreens. Coyotes howled from the far ridge, but the cabin remained quiet. Safe. She curled up on the bearskin by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, the scarf still tight across her eyes. He watched from the corner of the room for a long while. Not suspicious, just studying, as if trying to understand what had just happened, and why it didn't feel like a mistake. She didn't sleep. Not fully. But she didn't tremble either. And when he finally lay down on his cot, his last sight was the firelight flickering on her pale face, and the strange calm that had settled in the room like snow. Outside, in the darkness beyond the trees, something had shifted. Something old, something slow, like frost breaking on the surface of a long frozen lake. He didn't know it yet, but that night, the silence between two strangers had started to melt. The morning came slowly in the deep woods, where sunlight took its time slipping through the thick branches of pine and cedar. The air inside the cabin was still, carrying the faint scent of smoke, damp bark, and something warm baking on the stove. Outside, frost clung to the corners of the window panes, etching delicate shapes that faded with each growing ray of light. The lumberjack moved quietly through the small space, stirring a pot of oats and slicing a bruised apple with hands that seemed too large for such gentle work. He glanced occasionally toward the fire, where the girl remained curled under the wool blanket he had placed over her the night before. She hadn't stirred much, but her breathing had changed. Slower now, deeper, as if her body had finally accepted it could rest. When she sat up, it was with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to expect safety. Her hands brushed the air around her, seeking the edges of her new world. Though the blindfold remained, she moved with a strange assurance. She did not ask where she was, or who he was, or what he intended. She simply sat, listening, her face turned toward the sounds of morning, the pop of firewood, the scrape of metal on enamel, the quiet shuffle of boots on pine boards. It was not curiosity that guided her, but survival, the kind that comes after too many nights waiting for violence to rise with the sun. The man placed the bowl on the table and pushed it slightly toward the corner nearest her. She waited a few seconds, then stood and reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the wood until they found the bowl. She sat down slowly, spooned a bit into her mouth, and chewed with no urgency. Her movements were measured. She did not thank him aloud, but something in the way she held the spoon, a small tilt of the wrist, a pause before each bite, suggested gratitude buried under layers of caution. The lumberjack stepped outside into the biting cold and split logs in silence. The axe rose and fell with rhythmic precision, the echo of each strike bouncing off the trees like a heartbeat. Inside, she listened, not just to the chopping but to the distance it created. The comfort of knowing he had stepped away, the threat reduced. And yet she did not run. She could have. She had memorized the creak of the door, the count of steps to the edge of the porch, the faint slope of the trail leading down into the woods. But she stayed. When he returned, his beard frosted and hands raw from the cold, he found her standing near the window, both hands pressed gently to the glass. The blindfold was still in place, but her face was turned toward the light, absorbing it as if it offered something language could not. He paused in the doorway, watching her without interrupting. There was something almost reverent in the way she faced the sun, a quiet hunger for warmth that went deeper than the skin. Later, he handed her a brush, not as an order, not even as a gesture of pity, simply as something she might need. She took it after a moment, feeling its shape, its weight. Then she sat near the hearth and began to untangle her hair. Took a long time. There were knots, mats, strands caught together by weeks of dirt and wind and sleep without care. But she worked at it with patience, pulling gently, running her fingers through each snarl as though undoing something heavier than hair. He fixed the fence outside that afternoon, hammering in warped boards while watching for the bobcat that had been sniffing around his traps. Inside, she swept the cabin floor. It was slow, clumsy at first, her foot brushing against the broomstick, her hand gripping it too tightly, but she did not stop. The dust rose in faint clouds, catching in the light like breath. As the sun fell behind the ridge, shadows stretched across the clearing. He lit the lanterns one by one, their glow chasing the dusk into corners. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. He gave her another blanket and she accepted it with the same silence as before. Not cold, just careful. That night she lay closer to the fire. Her head rested on her arm, her breathing even. The lumberjack sat by the window, sharpening his blade with long, steady strokes. Every so often he glanced toward her, not out of suspicion, but out of something else. Something quieter. Not yet tenderness, but the kind of curiosity that asks no questions. Neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence had become a kind of language. One where trust was measured not in words, but in the absence of fear. In the fact that the door remained unlocked. In the simple act of sharing warmth without taking anything else. The wind howled that night, stronger than before. Snow fell sometime before dawn, dusting the roof, the trees, the broken trail back to town. But inside the cabin, the world held still. Two strangers, one fire, and the beginning of something unspoken. The days passed with a rhythm known only to those who lived beyond the edges of towns and timetables. In the dense timberland where snow muffled the sound of everything but the wind, the lumberjack and the girl settled into something that neither could name. The silence between them deepened, not in coldness, but in a way that wrapped itself around their routine like the fog clinging to the mountains in the early hours. He rose before dawn each morning, chopping kindling, checking the traps for fox or rabbit, hauling water from the creek before it froze over. His boots left the same trail every day, precise solitary marks along the packed snow. Inside the cabin, she waited, not out of helplessness but out of something heavier, a patient vigilance. Her blindness was no burden to her movements anymore. She walked without stumbling, her palms brushing walls and furniture like old friends, navigating the narrow room with the careful grace of someone who listened more than she looked. She cooked in silence. The first time she reached for the coffee tin, her hand moved straight to the edge of the shelf as if it had always known where to go. She fed the fire without needing to feel the heat. Her ears told her what the flames were doing. Her nose told her when the potatoes were ready. Her fingers, lightly grazing the battered table, mapped out where each tin cup belonged. He watched her, sometimes from the doorway, sometimes from across the room, but never once did he offer help. She did not ask for it. And so a strange partnership grew in the quiet, not built on instruction, but on observation. Not on speech, but on noticing. Once, as she passed the window, her hand rested on the sill. She turned her head, pausing there longer than usual, her body angled toward the mountains. He watched her chest rise as she inhaled the smell of cedar and cold. For a moment, he wondered if the blindfold she still wore was needed at all. She never removed it, not even to sleep. It was tied loosely, enough for slivers of light to bleed beneath the fabric, but tight enough to keep the world at bay. He hadn't asked why. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. But one afternoon, after the snowfall had turned the forest floor into a pale, unbroken canvas, something shifted. He had gone out to cut wood farther from the cabin, where the trees were thicker and untouched. The sky was a bruised gray, the clouds hanging low with the promise of another storm. By the time he returned, dragging a sled heavy with logs, the sun had dropped behind the pines, and the orange glow from the cabin windows flickered like a beacon through the branches. Inside, she sat by the fire, the blindfold removed, Her eyes, opened fully for the first time, stared straight ahead. Not at him, not at anything, but open all the same. He stood in the doorway, frozen not by cold, but by something deeper, something that twisted in his chest. Her gaze was hollow but steady, the way someone might look at a memory too painful to speak of. She didn't flinch when he stepped inside. She didn't turn. But she knew he was there. Later that evening, she returned the blindfold to her face, knotting it with the same practiced fingers that had tied it 100 times before. He didn't ask her why she wore it again. He only watched her hands, the way they trembled for a heartbeat, then steadied like the rest of her. She moved slower that night. She ate less. And when she lay by the fire, she curled her arms around her ribs like someone trying to hold together what the world had already broken once. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, carving a piece of pine with his pocket knife, the blade moving back and forth across the grain in a steady rhythm. He didn't know what shape he was making. Maybe he wasn't making anything at all. Maybe he just needed to move. The storm came just before dawn, shaking the shutters and piling snow against the door. But inside, everything remained still. A blind girl who may not have been blind, and a man who never asked questions he couldn't bear to hear answers to. When morning came, it came without birdsong. Just the soft hush of snow and the breath of two people pretending not to notice how far from normal they'd strayed. She rose and made coffee. He chopped wood. And neither of them spoke of the night her eyes had opened. The days rolled into one another with the steady rhythm of snow against the window panes and the muffled thud of logs being split out back. Winter had deepened its grip, encasing the world outside in silence. The forest, once alive with distant birdsong and rustling brush, now stood hushed under its white mantle, each tree like a sentinel frozen in thought. Inside the cabin, time moved slowly. The girl wore the blindfold again as if the previous night had never happened. But something in her had shifted, something that lingered in the way she paused before placing her hands on familiar surfaces, as though part of her was no longer guessing where things were, but confirming what she already knew. The lumberjack watched her differently now, not with suspicion nor pity, but with a quiet unease that came from knowing a truth that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. He began to notice the small signs he had overlooked before. The way she hesitated just slightly when pouring water into the kettle, listening for the exact splash that marked the right amount. The way she turned her head when the hawk cried overhead, even when it circled far beyond the trees. Once, he left a lantern unlit on the shelf. That night, she picked it up and lit it without fumbling. He had no explanation for how she could have known it was there, let alone that it needed to be lit. Still, neither of them spoke of it. Words remained scarce, like firewood in late February, measured and cautious. She moved through her day with quiet grace, tending to small tasks around the cabin, mending clothes with meticulous fingers, organizing the shelves, sweeping floors that barely needed sweeping. He spent longer hours outside, clearing fallen branches, checking traps, gathering pine cones for kindling, anything to keep his mind away from the puzzle living under his roof. One morning, a fox was caught in one of the snares he had set. Its leg was broken, its eyes glassy with pain and rage. He brought it back, uncertain why. She was kneeling by the hearth, rolling dough into careful, even strips for dumplings. When she heard him enter, she turned not to him but to the fox, her blindfold slipping slightly. She approached without fear, as though she'd seen its injuries long before he had. Her fingers moved gently over the fox's leg, finding the fracture without hesitation. She brought strips of cloth, splinted the bone, and fed it broth from her own hands. The fox trembled but did not run. He watched from the shadows, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't glance at him. When the fire died down that night, she curled beside the hearth with the fox nestled in her arms like a child. Her blindfold was still on, but her expression was calm, almost serene. And for the first time, he wondered if the fabric over her eyes wasn't a prison, but a shield, not for her, but for the rest of the world. The snow continued, heavier now. The roof groaned under its weight. Wind howled through the pines like wolves mourning something ancient and lost. But the cabin held, warm and quiet inside. She hummed when she worked, low and tuneless, the sound of someone who had known lullabies but forgotten the words. Sometimes, she stared toward the window for hours, as though waiting for something, or someone, that never came. He thought of asking her the truth, but the words never formed. How could he ask a girl what she had hidden behind cloth and silence? How could he demand an explanation for something that might unravel her carefully held dignity? So he let it lie, pretending to believe, pretending to ignore, and in that strange middle ground, they began to understand each other. He built a bench for her outside, near the edge of the woods where the morning sun touched the snow in soft golden light. One day he led her there, hand to elbow, then left her sitting alone. She tilted her face to the sky, blindfold on, hands folded in her lap. When he returned an hour later, he found a crude drawing etched into the snow beside the bench. A bird in flight, its wings stretched wide. The realization hit him like thunder in clear skies. She hadn't needed her eyes to see the world around her. She had memorized it. Every branch, every slope, every sound and scent and shift in the air. She had absorbed it all, built a map inside her mind, painted landscapes with senses sharpened by survival. She could see, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. And he understood then that she had not been pretending to be blind. She had been protecting herself from something far worse, the gaze of men who saw her as nothing more than a thing to be owned, to be pitied, to be misunderstood. She had learned to navigate without vision, because vision was what had made her vulnerable in the first place. He stood there for a long while, watching her fingers trace invisible shapes on her lap, the bird in the snow melting beneath the faint breath of midday sun. Whatever she had once lost, she had reclaimed in silence. And whatever she was hiding, he no longer needed to unearth. In that quiet, snow-wrapped place, he simply accepted her, blindfold and all. Under the heavy clouds of an approaching storm, the forest turned darker, its green hues fading into deep grays and shadows. The air felt damp and close, filled with the earthy scent of wet bark and pine. The lumberjack returned from the woods earlier than usual that day, dragging behind him a sled laden with fresh-cut logs. His boots left thick tracks in the softening snow, his breath rising in short puffs as he worked quickly to stack the wood under the lean-to beside the cabin before the storm broke. A wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and groaning through the trees with a voice that sounded older than time. Inside, the girl moved quietly through the cabin, her blindfold as constant now as her silence. The fox she had healed still lingered near her, limping less with each passing day, its coat fuller, eyes less wary. She had begun speaking to it in soft hums and broken syllables, not words exactly, but soothing sounds that wove through the space like threads of calm. The man listened from the doorway, watching her hand glide over the fox's back, her other hand finding the iron kettle and tilting it toward the fire as naturally as if she had eyes to guide her. He still hadn't spoken of what he knew, hadn't asked her to explain. Whatever secret she carried, she did so without shame, and that was enough for him. Later that night, as thunder rolled beyond the hills, the girl sat at the small table near the window, her face turned toward the rain that had begun to fall. It tapped against the glass in uneven rhythms, like fingers drumming a forgotten tune. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced over the walls, and the lumberjack sat in his chair carving a handle for a new axe. They existed in silence, a silence that had grown comfortable. Outside, lightning flickered, briefly illuminating the pines as if revealing something unseen between the branches. She flinched at the sudden brightness, not because it surprised her, but because it betrayed something she was no longer hiding well. As the night deepened, the storm began to wane. The wind died down, leaving only the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves and the low rustle of trees releasing their tension. She rose from the table and crossed to the window, her fingers resting on the frame. Without turning, she reached up and slowly untied the cloth from her eyes. She let it fall into her lap, then sat again, facing the darkened glass. He didn't react, didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched, heart stilled, as she blinked into the shadows, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything at all. But she saw. The following morning, she rose before dawn. The sky outside still held the soft blue of night receding, and mist clung low to the forest floor. She moved through the cabin with unhurried purpose, her steps light, her hands steady. She folded blankets, stacked bowls, swept the hearth, then opened the door and stepped into the chill. The fox followed her as she crossed to the edge of the woods, where the trees opened into a small clearing filled with wild grass and stumps from old felling. There, she stopped, her face tilted toward the sky, her eyes open. And then, as if pulled by some silent signal, she turned back and found him standing on the porch. Neither spoke. She did not raise her hand, and he did not step forward. But in that still moment between breaths, an understanding passed between them. He saw not a blind girl, nor a girl pretending blindness. He saw a survivor, a girl who had taught herself to walk invisible through a world that had never once tried to understand her. She stayed longer outside that day, sat on the bench he had built and watched the clouds shift. The world didn't look different to her. It had always looked this way. But for the first time, she wasn't alone in it. She no longer needed to hide behind a strip of cloth. She no longer needed to convince the world of her limits. That evening, she stood in the doorway as the sun set, casting fire across the mountaintops. He came up behind her, stopped just short of stepping inside, and waited. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Then she took the cloth from her pocket, held it for a moment, and placed it on the shelf by the door. It was not a declaration, not a moment meant for ceremony. It was simply the quiet end of a long journey, one that had led her not into darkness, but into the safety of being seen. The morning came quiet and pale, with mist curling around the pine trunks like memories unwilling to fade. The lumberjack stood at the edge of the forest, his axe untouched at his side, eyes drawn to the cabin where the girl now slept, her breathing steady, no longer labored by fear or exhaustion. The days since he brought her home had settled into a rhythm, gentle and cautious, like the steps of a deer unsure of trust. She had started moving through the cabin with more certainty, tracing outlines with her fingers, listening with intent, but it was her stillness that always caught him. How she'd pause before the window, as if trying to feel the shape of the outside world with her skin alone. But this morning, something had changed. She stood by the porch when he returned with firewood, her chin lifted, facing the trees directly. There was no need to speak. He watched her tilt her head, sensing something in the wind, her eyes seeming to track light though they held the familiar clouded veil. And then she stepped forward, not groping, not counting her steps, but walking with ease. He froze, breath trapped behind his ribs. She crossed to the water barrel, dipped a cup, and returned without falter. She had not stumbled, not once. The truth unfolded slowly, like the melting of snow on high ridges. She had seen him watching, and in that moment, her secret became too heavy to carry alone. She admitted she could see, blurred and fragmented, shadows and light, but enough. Enough to fake blindness before men who treated girls like livestock. Her father, broken by drink and grief, had sold her under the pretense of helplessness, thinking no one would look twice at a blind girl. But she had looked. She had memorized faces. She had remembered kindness. And in the lumberjack's silence, in his steady patience, she had seen something she never knew: safety. That night, by firelight, he carved a new frame for the front door, shaping cedar with long, slow pulls of his knife. She sat nearby, threading dried flowers into bundles to hang in the rafters. Neither said anything and neither needed to. A kind of peace had taken root, quiet and unshakable. In the shadows, her vision found contours of a life beginning again. Not as a possession, not as a burden, but as someone seen, not pitted. As someone chosen. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke through the clearing, and in its hush, the woods felt less wild, more like home.